Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen and hope that this works. The share screen is disabled. Is there someone else who can pull up my presentation by any chance? Oh, I just got it. Never mind. Great. So I am going to talk about rethinking the use of fines and fees and reducing the use of fines and fees to better incentivize justice. And I'll be talking about our experience in the United States, but hopefully there will be real pieces of this that are applicable elsewhere, and especially in Brazil. There we go. I start this conversation talking about Ferguson, Missouri, because for people in the United States, this is really was the introduction to the problem of fines and fees in the United States. When Michael Brown was killed by police, the city of Ferguson, Missouri erupted in protest, and night after night, people came to the streets asking for justice. And they were asking for justice not just because of violence by police against Black and Brown citizens, but also because of economic issues. The Department of Justice came and investigated the police department, and what they found is that the police department of Ferguson was inextricably linked with City Hall and especially the court system. The police were being used to write more and more tickets, which were enforced by prosecutors and by the court system in order to raise revenue. And this was causing tremendous harm to the people of Ferguson. What they found is that the city was actually collecting about 15% of all of its revenue from fines and fees, and were projected in the following year to actually get 23% of its revenue from fines and fees. And they exposed really a few different problems. First of all, that fines were too high for people to afford. So many fines were issued that people couldn't keep up. And when people couldn't pay, the courts were using very aggressive enforcement practices. They were suspending people's driver's licenses, and they were issuing warrants and arresting people. And at the time that the Department of Justice investigated Ferguson, in a town of 21,000 people, there were more open bench warrants for people's arrests than there were citizens of the city of Ferguson. And what became evident very quickly is this was not a problem of Ferguson. This is a problem throughout the United States, of towns, cities, and the justice system itself and courts relying on fines and fees for revenue. I think what's interesting here is when you look at where these dots are, they found 600 cities in the United States that are getting at least 10% of their revenue from fines and fees. And if you'll notice, they're concentrated in very particular states. You'll see some states in the South in particular, and New York. And the reason is that the concentration is in those places is because those are places that are that have municipal courts, that have many, many courts that are getting funding from fines and fees. And so there's an incentive in place to have more courts and to adjudicate more cases, because that is how the courts are making money. I just want to quickly talk about how I'm defining these terms, because I think the first one is really the one that's relevant here, which is fines. Fines are monetary sanctions that are imposed as punishment for violating the law. And that can be the criminal law, it can be the civil law. In the United States, we also talk about fees, which are costs, assessment, and surcharges, sort of like taxes for using the justice system. And they can be used to fund the justice itself or other government services. I don't think they apply in Brazil, but I often talk about fines and fees together, so I thought it would be helpful to just give that definition. In the United States, when you cannot afford to pay your fines and your fees, there are all sorts of adverse consequences that hit people. If you have a traffic ticket, the fine can double. There can be interest. There can be extra costs for actually going on a payment plan or delayed collections. Sometimes you can't get off probation or parole. There can be civil judgments entered against you, which can both damage your credit and lead to wage garnishment. You can be put on private probation, which again keeps you justice involved. You lose your voting rights if you have outstanding fines and fees in many places. And And even we have debtors' prisons in the United States. You can be reincarcerated because you can't pay your fines and fees. And it can happen either directly or because of staying on probation or parole and considering it a violation of your probation or parole for not paying. We also see driver's license suspensions. In more than half the states in the United States, if you don't pay off your fines and fees, your driver's license will be suspended. And this is actually leading to a whole host of problems that aren't easily apparent necessarily to people in power. The first problem is that reliance on fines and fees is a very unreliable source of revenue. We need there to be more crime in order to balance our budget when we're relying on fines and fees revenue. For the same reason it's unsustainable. The other problem is that it's inefficient. It's very expensive to collect money from people who don't have any. 85% of people who are going through the criminal legal system in the United States are indigent and can't afford even to pay for a lawyer. And so they also can't afford to pay fines and fees. And so we use more and more draconian tactics to try to collect from them because they don't have any money. This also exacerbates racial disparities in the criminal legal system. Because of the nature of policing in the United States, people of color are disproportionately stopped, charged, ticketed, and fined. And because of the demographics of poverty, they're also less likely to be able to pay. So through each step of the process, those racial disparities magnify the problem, and the burden of fines and fees fall very, very heavily on people of color. It also creates perverse incentives for courts and law enforcement when this is how we are raising revenue. And we also found in the United States that reliance on fines and fees reduces public safety, and it traps low-income communities and communities of color in particular in an endless cycle of punishment and poverty. And just to dig into this a little bit further, there was a study in the state of Alabama looking at 1,000 people who owed fines and fees. And they found that 8 out of 10, more than 8 out of 10, gave up basic life necessities in order to pay their fines and fees. The consequences for non-payment were so harsh that people gave up on paying rent, food, for healthcare, and even child support in order to pay this court debt. We also found that about 45% of the people who were surveyed had lost their driver's licenses because they were unable to pay, and about half said that they had been jailed at some point for failure to pay fines and fees. Not only do they fines and fees hinder reentry, but we also found that 38% of respondents in that survey admitted that they committed another crime in order to pay off their debt. And for people who owed a simple low-level offense like a traffic ticket, about 1 in 5 of them admitted that they committed a more serious offense in order to pay off their traffic tickets. And this really goes to the efficiency issue. What we found, a study by the Brennan Center, is that it costs more than 41 cents on the dollar on average, looking at 10 counties, to collect $1 of revenue. And in some places, we found that places were actually spending more to collect $1 of revenue than in Bernalillo County, which is Albuquerque, New Mexico. They were spending $1.17 to collect $1 of revenue. And this is because the draconian practices that we put in place to try to collect fines and fees revenue are extremely expensive. If we take people out of the regular economy and leave them more vulnerable to being incarcerated, it's extremely expensive. If we suspend a driver's license, which makes it very hard for people to work, it is very expensive because what happens is people will find their way back into the criminal legal system when they have no way of supporting themselves and their families. And what the Brennan Center study also found is that it costs more than 100 times as much to collect $1 of revenue from fines as it does to collect $1 of taxes. We also found that because so many people are poor who get fines and fees and can't afford to pay, much of this money, at least in the United States, is never collected. We only found data from about half the states in the United States, and we were able to document $27.6 billion in outstanding conviction fees and fines, and that doesn't account for other fines and fees that are assessed at different points in the system. We also found that this has a very negative impact on public safety. There was a study by researchers at Harvard that looked at 9,000 cities across the United States of average size or less. And they found that the average city was getting 1% or less of their revenue from fines and fees. But for each additional percentage of reliance on fines and fees for revenue, that was associated with a 6% decrease in resolution of violent crimes. In other words, when we use our police, our law enforcement, our prosecutors, and courts as revenue centers and debt collectors, we can't use them anymore to address actual public safety issues that are impacting the community. And so we found that the more reliant on fines and fees, the less able the criminal legal system was to address actual issues of public safety. And finally, this has caused a real problem between law enforcement and community. And I use this as an example, and I don't know how familiar people are there, but we've had many famous cases recently of Black men and women who have been shot by police. And many of them are happening during a simple traffic stop. And because the traffic stop is so common, especially in communities of color, it is leading to violence between community and police. Philando Castile was a man in Minneapolis, Minnesota, who was shot and killed by police. He had been pulled over by police 46 times, not to be issued tickets of public safety, but minor violations like driving on a suspended license when his license was suspended because he couldn't pay fines and fees. In those 46 stops, he was issued over 80 tickets. And although he got half dismissed, he still owed almost $7,000 in fines and fees. And his license was perpetually being suspended. And on the 47th time, he was shot. I also want to think about how much we're assessing against people. We know that in the United States, even before the pandemic, 40% of Americans didn't have ready access to $400 in case of an emergency. That means a simple fine or fee that we see in the criminal legal system is enough to destroy the financial stability of a person and their family. So we have to be very cognizant of how much we are charging and what people can actually afford. So in the United States, I'm going to talk a little bit about the issue of driver's license suspensions, which is one of the more draconian punishments we use here when people can't afford to pay fines and fees. Around the country in the United States, we documented 11 million people with driver's license suspensions because they couldn't afford to pay fines and fees. And I'm using this example because I think that there's something similar happening in Brazil, not with driver's license suspensions, but other ways that people are kept out of the mainstream economy when they can't afford to pay their fines. And the problem with driver's license suspensions, of course, is that you face an impossible choice. If you can stop driving because you're not legally allowed to, which means you can't access work, childcare, anything else, which also means you can't pay your ticket, which means you can't get your license back, which is a really vicious cycle. So unfortunately, what happens is most people continue to drive. The next time they're pulled over, they're issued a ticket for driving on a suspended license, which is a misdemeanor. Now they have a criminal record, more fines and fees, and possible jail time. And so it's a way that we take something like a simple fine and turn it into a way of criminalizing poverty. And it doesn't make sense economically. When we make it impossible for people to function in the regular economy, we're actually shrinking the entire economy. There was a study done in Phoenix, Arizona of a driver's license restoration program. 7,000 people got their licenses back. And what they found was that just giving those 7,000 people their licenses back over time projected an additional $149 million into the GDP of Phoenix, Arizona. What they found is that people got jobs and were able to get better jobs and higher wages. When people lost their license, on average, they lost $35,000 in income. And the good news about this kind of reform is that in the United States, this is bipartisan. There's recognition across the political aisle that these kinds of changes are practical and make people's lives better and make the economy better and make the court system work better. I'm going to, just for time's sake, I'm going to rush through some of this a little bit just to sort of explain the reform effort, though, that's happening in the United States. This is a relatively recent area of reform. California was the first state to stop suspending licenses anymore for unpaid fines and fees, followed by Washington, D.C. and the state of Idaho. And then we organized a national campaign working with over 150 groups from across the political aisle, and especially with community to understand their needs, and launched campaigns all over the country. And now we have about 20 states that have stopped suspending licenses for unpaid fines and fees. So this is an area where solutions are really impossible, and we think coming quickly. We hope to change the system very quickly. We also have a national bill right now that's being heard in the US Senate and House to incentivize states to stop doing these policies, to put money into the system to compensate this states for any money they lose if they stop doing this practice. We also have local action to help people get their licenses back. We have courts working with prosecutors in Durham, North Carolina to reinstate licenses and to forgive old debt so that people can get back on the road. There are also district attorneys all over the country who have declined to prosecute these cases anymore because they understand that driving on a suspended license, when the license is suspended for non-payment, is about poverty and not about danger to public safety. The other issue that we've been seeing across the United States is really figuring out how do we measure someone's ability to pay fines and fees. So at the Fines and Fees Justice Center, we put together policy guidance on how courts can properly consider someone's ability to pay, how they can put people on payment plans and let people pay over time, and how they can substitute community service as an alternative for people who can't afford to pay. You can find this on our website, and I encourage you all to look at it if it can be a useful tool. We vetted this with practitioners around the country to make sure that this was going to work, both for courts and for the people who are going through the criminal legal system, that this was a realistic solution. And what the real issue, and this is central to the mission of the Fines and Fees Justice Center, is fines have to be proportionate, both to the severity of the offense and to a person's ability to pay. Because if we have a fine that is just a simple dollar amount, what that costs me is very different from what it costs someone like Bill Gates, and very different from what it costs someone who makes minimum wage. We also found that what's important is to assess someone's ability to pay when the fines and fees are imposed. We don't want people to have to come back to court, deal with this separately, or have a separate process where a failure to appear is going to lead to further entrenchment into the criminal legal system. We also want to consider certain presumptions of indigence, that there are certain ways that we know that somebody has very, very little ability to pay, in which case we should be reducing the fine to the absolute minimum amount allowed by law. And we should have staggered amounts. We should have graduated fines based on someone's ability to pay, which is based on their income and their family expenses. And we should be substantially reducing fines and fees that are harming low-income communities. And here are some of the things that we consider for our presumption of indigence. If you are getting any public assistance, if you are in a mental health facility, if you earn less than what we consider our very low income standard, we have a HUD standard in addition to our poverty guidelines, which is location-based, so it's a little bit more accurate, and it considers how much housing costs are in a particular area. If you have a developmental disability, if you have been incarcerated or homeless in the last 12 months, if you have been, and if you are represented by a public defender, we presume that you are too indigent, you are too poor to pay anything but the very lowest amount. In addition to graduating how much people pay, we also want to let people pay over time. But that the calculation of payment plans should happen only after those fines are reduced to the lowest amount. And we consider a reasonable payment plan to be no more than 2% of someone's net monthly income, or $10 a month, whichever is greater. And if people are participating in this process and do it for a certain number of months, we should be forgiving the additional debt because the person has been held responsible. The other thing we like to consider is using community service as an alternative to fines and fees is because not everyone can afford to pay. We consider how we convert the rate of what you owe into community service hours. We use, after the fines and fees have been reduced to the lowest amount allowed, we then convert it using twice the local minimum wage. So in the United States, the federal minimum wage is about $7.50 an hour, and it can go up to a place like California where the minimum wage is $15 an hour. We multiply that by 2, and so for each hour you would work, $30 in California of your fines and fees would be forgiven. We also want to broaden the definition of what we consider community service. Traditionally in the United States, it has been very demeaning work, work that if you have any physical disability, you are totally unable to do. And so it feels like if you are poor, you can't afford to pay and leave the system. You are forced to do menial labor that can conflict with your regular work hours and your ability to hold down a full-time job. And so we really want to use community service as a way of addressing the criminogenic factors. So considering someone who is doing a substance abuse treatment or in school and getting a GED, we would count those towards community service hours because it is most likely to keep people out of the criminal legal system and on their way to being a successful and contributing member of society. And we do this, it's actually based on the law in Texas, which has not been at the forefront of reform, but they recognize that sending people to work, cleaning up trash on the side of the road was causing more harm than good and making it impossible for people to actually participate in community service programs, which they wanted to encourage people to use. And so they've given way more discretion to their courts to consider other forms of community service, and it's been very successful. The other areas of reform that we've seen and we pursue are waiving old and uncollectible debt. We know that when debt is on the books for a certain amount of time, nobody is getting that money. And so continuing to try to collect it and keeping people trapped does no one any good. We suggest setting a statute of limitations for old debt. Again, alternatives to fines and fees, disincentivizing the imposition of fines and fees. So ensuring that the fines and fees are not used to fund core government functions like the judiciary or anything in the court system, and reducing the use of fines, finding different behaviors that are really not dangerous to public safety that can be legalized. And I thank you very much and would be glad to answer any questions.